Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Dillian White is talking his next fight and he's thrown out a couple of potential opponents, one being Alexandr Povetkin, the other being Andy Ruiz Jr. So I'll talk about that and those names and some potential other next fights in this video, but I want to sort of start the video by a bit of context about White and his recent history, because obviously he's coming off a situation which he's been cleared off with UCAD, but ultimately some mud sticks. Some people are still down on Dillian White, and he's also coming off a pretty average effort against Mariusz Wach, who was pretty long in the tooth and faded at this point in his career. White went into that fight out of shape on December 7th, a career heaviest, didn't do himself any favors, and ultimately Wach was in that fight for much longer than he should have been, and ultimately it was much tougher than it needed to be. So Dillian White, heading into 2020, what is next? Automatically, you might think, well, it should be a pay-per-view. You know, he's been on pay-per-view his most recent fights up until the Wach one, which understandably he was only cleared one day before it, so he was never going to return on a pay-per-view until that situation was cleared. But are people ready to see him on pay-per-view next? And the other thing with this is, if he is pay-per-view, it has to be the right fight. And this is where you start talking about the names. So Alexandr Povetkin, Andy Ruiz Jr., I believe potentially Otto Wallin is another name, but maybe not pay-per-view. Joseph Parker, Michael Hunter, those sort of seem about the 5 likely suspects that you could just roll off the tip of your tongue as a potential next fight. But his quotes: I would like to be out at the end of March or early April. I'll be ready to go. I'm having my final week off, then back to training. I'll be training over Christmas. Let's start planning so we can build a good event and get a good fight. A fight that I've got notice for and I can train for. Make it another spectacle in London. And just to note, even though he says a fight that I've got notice for and I can train for, he was saying as early as October that he was going to be returning for a fight in December. So some of the whole career heaviest and, I didn't have enough time and notice, even though he was added late, he'd been training. And in the lead up to that fight, in fight week, he said the gym had been his refuge during the whole UCAD situation. So he can't just put it all to short notice, that career heaviest. He knew he was going to be fighting in December, either early December or on this card that's just been with Danny Jacobs. So I'm not wearing some of the excuses, and that's really what it is. But anyway, so he says Povetkin, Ruiz Jr. and Otto Wallin, those are the kind of fights. Even Manuel Char for the WBA regular title, if he wants it. That's a great fight. Char would be a good one. And I think we can almost rule that out anyway, because Manuel Char has effectively acted like Dillian White is a fly that's buzzing around, and Char has said that White is beneath him. Make of that what you will, but he's not going to give a fight to Dillian White. Char is chasing one of the champions, and at the moment, even though White is an interim champion in the WBC, Char has already swatted away White's advances for a fight in just recent months. But of these other names, so he mentions Otto Wallin, he mentions Andy Ruiz Jr., and he mentions Alexandr Povetkin. I'll start there first before going to the other names. So Otto Wallin, I could see that fight happening, but not on pay-per-view. And simply for the fact, how would it sell? As I mentioned, White coming off a pretty average effort against Mariusz Wach, and also the whole UCAD situation. Would that one actually do well? The Rivas fight did less than expected, 289,000 pay-per-view buys. Not terrible, but not exactly the sort of 400 plus that he had for the Parker and Chisora fights. So it has to be the right name. So if he did decide to face an Otto Wallin, maybe that would just be a regular Sky fight night. Go in there with Wallin, take a bit of a haircut on the pay. Wallin would have to take a haircut too, because he might be expecting against Dillian White that he would be getting a big check, similar to Rivas, similar to Parker, Chisora, etc. But maybe if his profile is not where it needs to be, this might be effectively, I don't want to say a tune-up, but Wallin, definitely for Dillian White, is a beatable fighter. Otto Wallin at this point has not proven he's an elite heavyweight boxer. He hasn't proven that he deserves to be considered top 30 at this point. He's got one decent win on his resume, which was Adrian Granat back in 2018. Since then, Adrian Granat has effectively faded off into the background. But since then, we know he faced Tyson Fury, but he lost that fight. Fury, bit down on his gum shield with, the blood streaming from one of his eyes after a couple of cuts, and still managed to go there and outpoint Otto Wallin. So it's hard for me to say that Otto Wallin is an elite fighter, but he does get some shine from that Fury fight because he performed better than some people expected. I thought he'd put up a decent display, a better display than Tom Schwarz, but I didn't expect him to win, and ultimately he didn't. So there is something to be gained from potentially fighting an Otto Wallin on a Sky Fight Night. Dillian Whyte can potentially get a knockout against Otto Wallin, or get a pretty good decision win or something similar like that. And ultimately, because he gave Fury a good fight, and if Whyte performs, that reflects well on Whyte. But would that be a pay-per-view? I'm not so sure at this point. I think it's the wrong time maybe for that type of opponent. Otto Wallin, not really a hugely known quantity compared to the likes of Andy Ruiz Jr. and Alexandr Povetkin. So Alexandr Povetkin, that would definitely be a pay-per-view if that happened. And remembering, he's just coming off a fight against Michael Hunter, probably the fight of the night in terms of action on December 7th in Saudi Arabia. Co-main event with Hunter, back and forth, ding-dong battle. Ultimately, it was a draw, a split decision draw. And you can make a case for either guy winning that. But at 40 years old, there is certainly some vulnerability with Alexandr Povetkin now. And maybe Dillian Whyte with that left hook might be able to knock him out. But it would certainly, no doubt, be an entertaining fight because Alexandr Povetkin would throw punches, would come forward, and maybe he would be able to catch Dillian Whyte. There would be risk associated with that fight. But he's a known name in the heavyweight division. He's fought Anthony Joshua before, just been on that Anthony Joshua undercard in a very good fight with Hunter. So I believe you could sell that fight and would be much more successful than, say, if you were to put Otto Wallin on pay-per-view with Dillian Whyte. But Andy Ruiz Jr., that's a fight I think that would be interesting for a number of reasons. Obviously, having been a former unified champion, I think it could be a good fight. And in that one, maybe I would favour Ruiz Jr. if he got himself back into decent condition. Big ifs there, but also Dillian Whyte. What sort of shape will he turn up in? But I guess, promotional lines with Ruiz being a PBC fighter, would it actually happen? And before people say, oh, well, he got the shot against Joshua, he was handpicked to get a heavyweight title shot. They were never going to turn that down. What's really on the line here for them if they can't have their fight at Ruiz Jr. on their network? I mean, maybe the whole WBC mandatory, if that's up for grabs, maybe that would be enough, but I would think that Ruiz Jr., when he comes back, will fight within the PBC stable, but also on a PBC network, either Fox or Showtime. I'm not sure that he's just going to be farmed out to be on a pay-per-view on Sky Sports and DAZN. I just think, the realities of where things are at the moment with the politics of boxing, these silos that have formed, probably prohibits that fight happening right now. But maybe that's just Dillian Whyte throwing out a name, when really he's targeting Alexandr Povetkin or Otto Wallin, more likely Povetkin. And I think that's a winnable fight against Povetkin, and he could have that on pay-per-view. He could probably do decent numbers, but I guess it depends, does the Russian want that fight with Dillian Whyte? And if it could pay him a 7-figure payday, well, maybe that would be enough to tempt him, have the fight, and potentially that's his last fight, win, draw, or lose. But of the other couple of names that I mentioned at the start of the video, Joseph Parker. This is seemingly a backup option for Dillian Whyte right now. Before the whole UCAD situation was resolved, he came out in public and effectively said, he would be keen to have a rematch with Joseph Parker, something he hadn't said until that point. And I sort of mused at the time that probably his situation with his stock being down, led him to thaw on that in public, because if this UCAD thing had have dragged on, it might have been the most lucrative fight out there for Dillian Whyte. And that fight is always going to be there. It was a good first fight, but it will always be there. And Dillian Whyte, now that he's cleared UCAD, he can pretty much go off and do what he wants. But I think Parker will always be in his back pocket for when he wants to use it. And Parker is pretty desperate to get that rematch. And the other outside choice that could be an option is Michael Hunter. As I mentioned, very good fight with Alexandr Povetkin. It was a draw, and he did very well in that fight. Came out, just blitzed Povetkin in the early part of the first round, and you sort of thought, wow, he's just going to roll through him. But very back and forth action. He's a fun fighter, and that style matchup with Dillian Whyte, I think it would be fun to watch. And that could potentially be on pay-per-view. Maybe it's not as juicy as a Povetkin fight at this point in terms of numbers it might generate, but it wouldn't be bad, and I certainly think it's a better option than Otto Wallin. Otto Wallin probably won't sell the event as well as a Michael Hunter, who actually does sort of do all sorts of sneaky trash talk that sort of flies under the radar, or has for a lot of his fights. But White's got options, and it could be that he starts off on a Sky Fight night, not pay-per-view, and maybe that's where an Otto Wallin could be the option. Or maybe he goes straight back into a pay-per-view, because I think people forget that White has prioritized eliminators and other things and put them to the side to chase money fights with Joseph Parker, Derek Chisora, even Oscar Rivas. You know, he could have gone other ways and fought other opposition, but he has gone for money fights. So if he was to get the option of a Povetkin and that came off, I could see that working. And maybe Otto Wallin is sort of, second option. Ruiz Jr., I think, is more remote, although a very good fight. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.